Welcome to the Good and Basic Podcast, a long-form conversation with Joseph and Joseph, mostly about the videos in our channel, but also, and this is actually something we're going to talk about today, is it spreads out everywhere, right? It sends out roots in all directions.
Yes, it does. It starts infecting, cross-pollinating.
Yeah. I like cross-pollinating more than infecting, but such as it is, right?
Connotations matter.
Yes. There's social media information in the video description / podcast notes. And, we're really glad to have you here. Today's going to be a great conversation. We are going over the martial arts videos that we posted last week and adding a lot more. And really, we're mostly going to be adding a lot more. Joseph and I have both thought about how this is a podcast that has been long in the making, like literally 10 years in the making.
Gosh, longer than that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you've been doing Taekwondo since... how old?
I'm not even going to mention that.
Okay, such as it is. So thank you very much for listening, and here we go. Let's actually start right there.
Start with our backgrounds.
Yes.
I'll go first, then you go?
Perfect.
Sounds good. I got involved in Taekwondo when I was about 11.
Oh, sorry, I'm going to pause you for just a second. We are going to have a little bit of construction noise in the background. We're sorry about that, but we did an audio test, and we think it's going to be pretty manageable. So our apologies, and we're just going to march straight forward. So
it was unfortunately unavoidable.
Yeah.
So it started when I was about 11, and it was either Taekwondo or Kung Fu. There were two studios near my house, and Taekwondo was cheaper, and so that's where I started. So that factors into
that's a reason.
What made it better. But I had a really, really good instructor when I started out, and learned for many, many years. Was a really kind of a dismal student for most of that time. Finally, we got to about 4.5 or 5 years in, and I was only about halfway through the 10 belts up to black belt. And my mom said, well, we're pulling your funding because you're not making much progress, and this isn't apparently a good use of our funds and resources. And I said, well, I decided to kind of stick it to my parents by applying myself more thoroughly. Maybe that was the intent, the reverse psychology in the first place. But it turned out to be the best thing for me. I pushed really hard, and in the next 6 months, I made as much progress as I had in the previous 4 years and got my black belt in the middle of high school. So then did that. A couple of years later, I was needing a job, and so I went and talked to my instructor and said, hey, do you need an assistant? And he said, I would love to hire you, but unfortunately, my business is struggling, and I wouldn't be able to pay you. And I said, well, I guess I could work a little while for free because that would be a really cool experience. And so he said, okay. So I worked for him for free for about a month before he got acquired by another studio, which was run by a remarkably qualified instructor, master named Master Kwan. And in the course of the discussion there, eventually my instructor left to go work at yet another studio, but I ended up staying there at with Master Kwan and worked for him for a couple of years before leaving on a religious mission. So that's kind of my background in a nutshell. I have taught off and on. I taught at a high school level for a little while. And yeah, that's my background with Taekwondo.
And as I recall, Master Kwan is like really, really, really qualified.
Yeah.
Right? Like this was actually kind of a once in a lifetime opportunity.
Yeah, it was kind of the Mr. Miyagi thing.
Okay. Yeah.
It was amazing. Very, very difficult experience, but very good. I mean, I helped him build his studio as he was starting up fresh in a new area. And as such, we had less than 20 students when I started and well over 100 before I left.
Good deal.
Yeah.
So as a small child, I never had any real exposure to any martial arts at all. In high school, the same high school we both went to, I did a semester or two, I can't recall precisely, of Taekwondo, and that was nice. But around, I think, my junior or senior year of high school, I ran across, I can't recall exactly how it happened, but I think I ran across these books by someone by the name of Sifu Wankoo Kit. And, there's a bit of a disclaimer here. He claims that he is, I think, a 6th generation successor to the Southern Shaolin Monastery, which is quite the claim because there's scholarly arguments about whether or not the Southern Shaolin Monastery ever existed. So I've done a little bit of digging into this, and I cannot confirm his claim, but I cannot deny it either. I do not think there is enough evidence either way. That was my judgment. Anyway, so he has a website that I'll link to, and then I'll also link to a few of his books, which I found quite helpful. And he teaches a variety of Shaolin arts. He teaches Qigong, he teaches Taiji Kwan, he teaches Shaolin Kung Fu. and a few other things. Anyway, so I ran across these books and I was like, like this just looks like a fun thing to try.
Yeah.
Right? Like this looks like a fun thing to try. And he's quite good at describing all the individual patterns, so you can reconstruct these forms, pretty effectively.
I still think it's impressive. So, bragging on his behalf for just a moment, I mean, when we were just out of high school, you taught yourself Gyan Forms. Yeah, that's the long,
straight sword, Chinese straight sword.
3-section staff forms. And, also a form from Avatar: The Last Airbender.
Yeah, we worked out
the Dancing Dragon from the Firebending Masters episode, which is one of the best episodes ever. You have a knack for learning how to do katas or four-pattern forms from written sources, which I think is quite an achievement. I mean, I've had the benefit of instructors showing me exactly where I'm going wrong. No, tighten your gut here, stand a little differently, all that sort of stuff.
And I largely did not have that, right? Which probably makes me worse in many respects, but also, like we've talked a little bit about the scholastic method. The sword fighting diagrams, right? You put all the pictures out and then you have to reconstruct them and figure out how the form went, right? And that's kind of what I ended up doing, right? Is I'll learn the individual pattern, the individual movement, and I'll have to think, wait a second, what is this for? Right? And how does this flow naturally into the next movement?
Yeah.
Right. So it was its own kind of education for sure.
The reinterpretation thing. To clarify that reference, we will be doing a video probably in the next 2 or so months about the scholastic method. Short version is this. The scholastic method is the teaching style that was used in the medieval period, and it's way better than you would think. It involves
like many old things.
What you do is you have a pattern where you receive a lecture, you ponder over it, you deconstruct it, then you reconstruct it, and that pattern is designed to make it so that you, as the student, can reach parity in terms of your competence with your instructor.
It's fundamentally an imitation exercise, right? You imitate the patterns of the master, and you imitate the processes of the master, and by doing so, you become the master.
Yes, or at least a peer with the master.
Yeah, at least a peer.
Yep.
Yeah.
So we'll talk more about that later from Oxford.
Yeah, so that's the basic background. I think maybe this is a point where we launch into forms, right?
Yeah.
So this is interesting. So for those who may not know, in martial arts, almost all martial arts I've ever seen have had something like this, where it's a pattern. I think in Taekwondo they're called forms usually, right?
Yeah, the Korean term is pumse.
Okay.
In Japanese, it's kata, which is the most common word that you'll hear thrown around by English speakers. And then in Chinese, it's something.
I actually do not recall.
I don't recall either.
I think I just always called them forms. Anyway, so what it is it's a series of movements, right? Like you'll practice let's see, I'm trying to remember the Taekwondo black belt one, right? You might practice a high block, a low middle block, and then a low block. Done in a specific way in a specific sequence, right?
Yes.
The whole form is perfectly rigid. You don't vary, and the goal of the form, at least as you're practicing the form, is basically to imitate that perfect rigidity, right? Like that. You're trying to imitate the movements perfectly.
It's a lot like it's like a dance routine or like a song.
It's like scales. It's like scales on the piano mostly. I would say if
similar.
you play the piano, it's like playing scales on the piano, or like if you've ever sung in a choir or even just done voice lessons, then they'll have you do warm-ups beforehand, and that's sort of a little bit what it is. Anyway, well, it's an interesting thing to think about because, like, when people think about martial arts, one of the things that they think about is well, obviously you want to be able to use it in a fight, right? Is the combat applications, and so sometimes people look at the forms and think, well, wait a second, that looks pretty useless because all it does is it teaches me to
fight a bunch of invisible ninjas if they were to line up in exactly this order with this timing
and do exactly the right, punch me in exactly the right ways that I know how to block.
Yes.
Yeah.
So you could say this is a useless waste of your time and that it's training you to be too rigid and that you're going to lose your capacity, and therefore we should throw you just in the cage and have you learn it the proper way.
Yeah.
Mano y mano.
Yeah. So what is the response to that?
Well,
why is that terribly wrong?
Well, here's one of the things that's really interesting is in the martial arts, particularly the Japanese martial arts, there are two ending portions to the word. There's Judo and there's JiuJitsu. So what is this do and what is this jutsu? Do is very similar to the word Dao. It's same root, same word, actually. In Chinese, it's referred to as the Dao. In Japanese and Korean, it's referred to as Do, which means the way. And you can think of this as being like the cosmic way, the pattern of all things, the I kind of intuitively understand how the universe is flowing and can follow that through. Think Jedis following the Force.
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it.
So
it's not a perfect way to think about it. It's definitely a good way to think about
that's
it.
Do.
Yeah.
So you take this principle, Judo, this principle of being able to use, to grapple with an opponent and to be able to throw them and to be able to use their momentum. And you think Do is going to be a martial art that's based very much on principles without a lot of focus specifically on technique. It's going to be very abstract on the level of these are the general patterns, now go forth and practice. And then JiuJitsu, Jutsu means technique. And so it's going to say, if attacker does this, then you do this. And it's a series of if-then statements, and it's quite broken down. And if they do this, I do this. And the responses are very technically oriented, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. So one of the things that I find interesting is that in Taekwondo, which means the way of the hand and foot, they have these incredibly rigid floor patterns. Mm-hmm. And I think the fact that they are deliberately useless is an important feature of the way that you are getting the Do. The idea is that you get to the Do, by practicing these highly rigid, not terribly useful forms. But what they are training you to do is how to internalize turning and executing a block, turning your head before you turn the rest of your body, the way that you stand, the way that you walk, so that all of that becomes pre-programmed, and then the actual execution of the fight, the strategic side is learned separately. That way you're not getting confused or not relying too heavily on a series of techniques that are supposed to save you in every situation, but inevitably won't.
Well, and if I could give my take on it, one of the videos we posted this week where I explained why everything is kung fu, I include a clip from the Forbidden Kingdom, and I focused mostly on what Jackie Chan's character said. Mm-hmm. But Jet Li's character in that same clip says the way he describes it. Well, what he says is learn the form but seek the formless, right? Which form and formless is not a bad way of thinking about Do and Jitsu, right? I mean, this is Asian philosophy, which can be a little challenging, right? It's not always easy to interpret, but it's a good way to think about it. I think that you can say, well, Do and Jitsu roughly correspond to the form and formless. And what he says is learn the form but seek the formless. And then I believe a little later in that clip he says learn it all and then forget it all. And so I think it sort of describes this process, right? Where, like I've experienced this playing the piano. I don't know if any of you play a musical instrument, but
I think that's
as I play
analogy.
the piano, as I'm starting a piece, I will have to painstakingly and consciously work through every single piece of that song, right? And it's a challenge, and I'll stop and I'll go back a few measures and play that through again, right? And I'll plod through it. It's slow, it's laborious, it's conscious, it's not fast and reflexive, right? But by doing that enough, by following that sort of that form, that structure, that slower, more conscious, more deliberate method of practice, by doing that long enough, you eventually pop out the other side, kind of. You emerge on the other side, and it becomes second nature, right? And it becomes something that you can do reflexively. So much so that there are songs that after a while, after I've played them for a while, if I stop and think about it, I won't be able to play it anymore, right? It is so embedded in my reflexive memory that I cannot. It takes me a while to consciously deconstruct what it is that I'm doing.
Yeah.
Right. So I think that's how I've always looked at forms in martial arts. And well, we'll talk about that. I want to say something else about this, but this is how I've looked at the forms in martial arts. Is that it's a thing. It's you learn the form, but you need to seek the formless, right? And the formless is how to stitch together all those practiced pieces in a new situation.
So here's a question that I have
Sure.
for you. In playing, one of the things that you've eventually gotten into is composing.
Yeah.
And so
A little bit.
Can you? I have a brother-in-law who can play a mood. Like he'll feel a particular way, and he is so competent with the piano and does what he wants it to do. He has trained the connection between his mind, his fingers, and the piano keyboard such that he can literally express whatever he's feeling in musically.
Yeah.
I mean, have you had that kind of experience?
Well,
I mean, not that specifically, but
not like your brother-in-law, no. But go ahead.
You have creative expression by having embraced the form previously.
Yes. Well, and this that's a really good question. It ties right back to the second nature video we did a while ago, right? That
we should probably link that.
Yeah,
right there.
The form properly measured is, the form properly practiced is a tool for the formless. It's not the enemy of the formless, right?
Yes.
And so discipline is not the enemy of freedom. It's the enemy of freedom if you do it in the wrong way, right? But but discipline approached in the correct way is the friend of freedom, right? And yeah, I would say that we're like, well, I mean, I think it's, I mean, let's just talk about the fact I actually had a similar experience. You described how when you were learning Taekwondo as a child, there was this point where like you almost gave up, right? Your parents were like, okay, we're done. And I actually had a similar experience. I can't remember exactly how old I was, but my parents were making me take piano lessons, and I was so done, right? And what they've told me, I didn't know it at the time, but what they've told me is that they were this close. They were so close to dropping the lessons, and then something happened. I guess I just found songs that I liked playing, and now I just took off and became, not really good. Like, I'm not a real classically trained pianist, but I became pretty good. I became pretty good, right? And so it's another one of those things where, like, because I had all that discipline I think I did piano lessons for about 10 years. Because I had 10 years of accumulated discipline, I can now go play the piano for fun, right? Like, the discipline has become an instrument, a building block in the edifice of freedom.
So let's contrast the interest in forms and talk about some of the virtues of the group that says that the forms are terrible.
Yeah.
So I think we need to make that case convincingly.
That combat application.
So
is this the combat application issue? Yeah. Okay.
So the mixed martial arts community, which is basically the martial arts community on the internet, will look very hard at combat effectiveness, and they're looking to cut away everything that seems extraneous or non-productive or
because you look at a 3,000-year-old martial art and you're like, oh, this was for a different time, this was for a different place. Like, we have science now, we know how strong bones are, we can like figure all this stuff out, we can do the physics calculations to create the perfect kick.
And to be fair, there's some really weird stuff floating around there on the internet. I mean, there's a number of Chinese martial arts that say, I don't even need to hit you in order for you to rupture your organs. I just do the thing.
Do the thing.
And that seems kind of hokey.
Yeah.
And so, very hokey. So there are things that you need to cut away. Bruce Lee had he wrote this fantastic collection of notes, and he was an extremely competent martial artist in addition to being an actor. Mm-hmm. And he actually has background in philosophy, and he wrote a series of notes which were published after his death called the Daodejing, which is the way of the intercepting fist. And one of the things that he talks about is that in the martial arts, we don't learn by adding so much as by subtraction, by removing things that are not helpful.
Which is actually
a true principle.
I'm assuming he pulled that directly from the Daodejing. There is a line in the Daodejing that, depending on your translation, it'll say something like, in the pursuit of knowledge, every day something is acquired. But in the pursuit of the way, in the pursuit of the Tao, every day something is dropped.
Like carving.
Yeah.
The analogy is less like sculpting where you're adding things on with clay, and more like you're chipping away everything that doesn't belong until you're left with the truth.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of profound goodness in there. And also, I mean, even if you embrace this idea of seek the form and then seek the formless, what you do is, as a new student, you're looking for that second nature, that ability to be combat effective. And so you get the form first, and eventually you do forget it all. But you can't forget it all until you've learned it.
Mm-hmm. Well, and do you mind if, like, so I taught writing for 2 years at a university, and the writing is a hard thing to teach. It's a very hard thing to teach. But I think a fair definition of how do you know someone is a master writer is that they can use all the techniques and deploy them in the appropriate situations, right? That it's not just about learning a few writing skills, right? Like being able to write a poem, or being able to write a good 5-paragraph essay, or being able to write a good critical analysis of a piece.
It's not just about the rules. It's not just about never use sentence fragments.
It's about knowing how to break the rules creatively and how to use the right rules. Right.
It's about calibrating yourself to recognize what good writing is.
Yeah.
And you can approximate that, and it's always an approximation with rules. But in the end, it's about other things. It's about the effect. It's about how effective it is at communicating. It's about the flavor and the tone. And
you need to learn the form, but seek the formless.
Yeah, and the rules help you to approximate, but they don't give you what good writing is fundamentally.
Yeah, roughly. I mean, Asian philosophy, words are hard, right?
Yes.
But yeah, so, sorry, we were talking about mixed martial arts.
Mixed martial arts and the virtues. So the mixed martial arts community has their philosophical origins in Bruce Lee's philosophy.
Which I've read the Tao of Jeet Kune Do. We're going to link it in the description. And like it's very good, I think.
There's a lot of really good stuff.
It is a book I'm glad I read, and I would definitely reread it.
There's this funny balance, and it's similar, again, to another video we've done, more philosophical, on the virtue of hippies. where there's something for the destructive element, the let's throw away everything and reconsider it from the ground up and see just what works.
Yeah.
And there's also something for tradition, the idea of the Chesterton's fence. I'm not sure why that's there, and so do I throw it away? I mean, where is the burden of proof here? And it's a little bit like in that video, I was sitting in a bathtub that was getting cankered over with mineral deposits. And so they had to come with a crowbar and chip those out. But if you chip too aggressively, you puncture the bathtub and then it doesn't work anymore. And so it's a real trick to remove those things that need to be removed and retain the things that need to be retained. So that's kind of, speaking generously, that's where I get to.
Yeah.
When I was teaching martial arts, one of the things that was kind of funny to me were the MMA guys who would come in and assume that they could do a 2-week crash course in Taekwondo, which is famous for kicks, and then that would give them really good kicks, and then they could do a 2-week crash course, several month crash course in JiuJitsu, because everyone knows that's the best martial art, and then
for grappling,
for grappling,
yeah,
one-on-one, and then that would make them competent in the cage after a little bit of boxing to round them off.
Yeah.
And that idea of the 2-week crash course and all of these things, where you have this idea of with the powers combined, Captain Planet style, where you're taking a little bit from here and here and here and blending it together, and then you're gonna fix it. I don't have a lot of faith in that model, just because I could see some people who had dedicated to mastery. I mean, in Taekwondo, which is not designed for grappling, or at least not at the beginning. But I think mastery of one thing is probably more important than surface level competence in a few things.
So one thing you've mentioned to me that's really interesting, right? You have a black belt in Taekwondo, and you taught with Master Kwan, who is very, very, very competent, right? One of the interesting things that you mentioned to me is that there are black belt forms in Taekwondo that are almost exclusively dedicated to hand techniques.
True.
Right? And so the idea is, well, actually, like if you go deep enough into Taekwondo, you will get a lot of hand techniques. And so there is this, it is sometimes a false idea to
pigeonhole.
You can foolishly seek breadth when seeking depth would have gotten you the same kind of breadth of technique, right? Where if you I don't know, maybe I think it can potentially be a legitimate approach to go to a variety of different martial arts and learn what you can from each of them, right? Like I think that's what Bruce Lee did, and I'm like, okay, that's
yeah.
That is viable, right? But it's wrong to think, these martial arts that are very old, that have hundreds or thousands of years of accumulated history. Like you go deep enough into them, and there's all kinds of stuff, right? You go deep enough into Taekwondo, and all of a sudden you have black belt forms devoted almost exclusively to hand techniques.
Yeah.
And so there is something that is missed by what is it?
Naively throwing the baby out with the bathwater. I mean,
Yeah.
that's what I want to fundamentally say, but
Yeah.
then you read my biases there.
Yeah.
One thing I want to talk about briefly is what makes a martial art better or worse. And this is a fascinating question to me, because one of the principles of MMA is this idea that we're going to cut out all the things that don't work and keep only the things that work. And over time, we're going to perfect this thing. And one of the things that is really cool about MMA, particularly, like the UFC Ultimate Fighting Challenge, these sorts of things, is that it's in practice. So it's not just a measure of how good your technique is, it's a measure of how good your conditioning is. And so it's about how well you can take a punch, how well your strategy holds up after somebody punched you in the face, a la Mike Tyson quote.
Yeah.
Was that Mike Tyson? Everybody has a plan.
I thought it was Muhammad Ali, but who knows?
Yeah.
Who knows?
Great quote in any case.
Yeah. Everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face.
Yeah. There's something deeply good about that. Now, you could say, okay, we've brought all these ideas in the martial arts, and we've combined them, and now we have this super martial art that's been created that will beat the socks off of anything ever seen before. And to that, sure, in that context, what works and what doesn't work, and you can see whether it works or doesn't work based off of the rules. If they won or lost. We can measure that. It's real. But here's the trick: it's also a very specific circumstance. For one thing, it's always one-on-one.
Mixed martial arts fights.
Yeah, mixed martial arts, UFC style fights. They are always optimizing to a particular rule set. In other words, that martial art is perfect for when, specifically, Both fighters prepared and knew the fight was coming.
Mm-hmm.
Both of them are in the same weight class. Both of them they know that it's only going to be one-on-one. Mm-hmm. They know that there are not going to be any weapons allowed. Mm-hmm. They know that they're going to be wearing gloves. And the list goes on and on and on. You know that you're going to have, a mouth guard. Mm-hmm. And you know that you're not allowed to do small joint manipulation.
And that's not necessarily a bad thing.
These are all fantastic things.
You have to optimize for some situation. But
yeah.
The problem comes when you think that when you've optimized for one situation, you think you've found the one true thing that will fit in all situations, because it won't. You've optimized for one situation. And it's a very specific situation.
You look at jiu-jitsu in particular. Jiu-jitsu is the best thing on the planet for grappling. If you end up on the ground, the guys who have trained in jiu-jitsu will beat you. I mean, that's their turf. And a lot of these guys who train jiu-jitsu will say, well, like 70% of all fights end up on the ground, to which the proper response is 100% of them started on your feet. Why didn't you win there?
Well, so this actually keys into something else that I wanted to touch on, right? And when I posted the video about the Wing Chun dummy on Saturday, there were a couple of comments, talking about the combat effectiveness of Wing Chun, right? And this is actually a very old question, right?
Even within China.
Yeah, when you watch martial arts movies, particularly Chinese martial arts movies, you'll see them fighting in a ring, right? And the goal is to knock somebody else out of the ring. And there are centuries-old conflicts in China about whose kung fu is the best, right?
Which style, my family.
Yes, whose style pride of kung fu is the best, right? And I couldn't help but think, when somebody said, I can't believe you think that Wing Chun is combat effective, and I'm actually not going to train in Wing Chun, so maybe the whole question is a little moot. But my question is, well, is Wing Chun is Wing Chun kung fu combat effective? And the answer is, well, I don't know who's using it. And for what?
And where and against how many?
Yeah, like a 10-year-old who has earned a black belt in karate, put them against a 40-year-old 200-pound guy who doesn't know anything, right? And that poor 10-year-old is going to die, right? If it comes to that, right? I just think the question of which style of martial arts is best is the wrong question. Is jiu-jitsu better than everything else on the ground? And my answer is, well, I don't know. Who's the person, right? Who's the person who's practicing? And what, you've mentioned a couple things. There's just all sorts of factors, right? So
this is
I don't think
one of the reasons why I think so. On the one hand, we can say that question, which martial art is best, is stupid. It's a silly question.
But I think it's the wrong question.
It is a question which, while pointed in the wrong direction, I mean, if you're looking for just a flat answer, you're not going to get one. Mm-hmm. And in that sense, it's the wrong question. Mm-hmm. But in the sense of, it will help you to start teasing out a lot of really interesting problems. Mm-hmm. And in that sense, it's very much the right question. For example, it forces you to think about all these factors and to recognize what goes into a conflict. It forces you to think if you try to answer the question directly, if you give an answer to that question, the answer is wrong. But if you ask the question, it will open up fields of inquiry.
I want to say it's kind of a Zen koan in a way.
Yeah.
Right. It's not designed to be answered. It's designed to be asked, and the asking of it is what brings enlightenment.
Which brings in the context and brings in
to bring in a whole other factor too, right? I believe the specific comment was something about how can't believe you think that Wing Chun is practical, right? And again, once you say practical, it's like, well, okay, practical for what, right? Are we talking about fights? When I was practicing Shaolin arts in high school, combat effectiveness was not the number one thing on my mind, right? Like I said in my Everything is Kung Fu video, right? Like, would it have made me more combat effective? Marginally, yeah, but not a lot, And that was totally fine with me. I was aiming for a completely different set of things. And this is actually kind of interesting because the legendary origin of Kung Fu is that a Hindu monk, Bodhidharma, came over the mountains from India into China and found a monastery. And the monks there were actually not physically strong enough to meditate for long periods of time. And so he taught them a set of exercises called the 18 Lohan hands that, at least according to legend, formed the basis for the later development of Shaolin Kung Fu. And so, the truth is that, at least legendarily speaking, the origins of Kung Fu were not precisely for fighting at all. They were for meditation, right? And from my study of Kung Fu, right? And I've already done my disclaimer about Wankoo Kit and so forth, right? But my study of Kung Fu is it's a very balanced, or at least the varieties that I was studying were very balanced in terms of, were they aiming at a combat application? Absolutely. But they were also aiming at health and wellness. They were aiming at fitness. They were aiming at lots of, let's say, mystical Chinese concepts like qi and energy flow and so on and so forth. And I'm a little loath to touch that in either direction, either to confirm or deny. But again, like practical for what? I wasn't really training for a fight, and that's okay. It's not a problem.
One other thing, I've loved that everything you said. I agree with. There's this.
Which is actually kind of ironic real fast, because I think, based on our conversation last week, I think I realized that, just a private conversation we had last week, I think I've been in more situations than you have where I've thought, oh gosh, I actually might have to fight to preserve my life. Is that true?
Possible. I haven't had a lot of those. My general policy as far as fights go is try to be friendly to everybody and avoid places where you're going to get into a conflict, and then be ready for a conflict if you do, but
I was in South America for 2 years serving a religious mission, and there were multiple points where I was within about 30 seconds of having to fight to preserve my physical health. So anyway,
glad you made it out.
Yeah, well, thank you. So anyway, you were saying.
Yeah. So one other thing I want to ask. So this question, which martial art is the best, is perhaps not directly answerable. You can't just say, you point to that one and say, okay, this particular brand of Kung Fu, that's the one. That is the one true and only Kung Fu. Instead, one of these other things that's teasing out, we've got context, we've got, okay, what is your purpose? What is the thing that you were trying to achieve? What is this goal? Health, wellness, improving your chi, improving your focus, improving your confidence, being able to handle your own in a street fight, feeling like you can handle your own, which is a separate thing.
Confidence is its own survival skill.
It is. And frankly, it makes you, walking confidently is one of the things that's going to dissuade predatory criminals. So I mean that in and of itself is an advantage.
If you don't look like prey, you're less likely to be prey.
Yep. But in addition to these, there's kind of a postmodern take on the question as well, which is, where are the boundaries between one martial art and another?
Which it's not necessarily that easy to tell.
It isn't.
Right.
If you break it down and say, okay, I studied Taekwondo, what does that mean? Were you learning how to do a punch in a way that is specific and unique to Taekwondo? Fundamentally, if you start breaking down punches, you'll see that there's kind of a taxonomy of punches where you've got vertical knuckle punches and horizontal ones, and you can land with either the 2-knuckle facet or the 3-knuckle facet, or hit open hand. I mean,
there's also Phoenix Eye Fist, which is first knuckle
then
forward.
You get into the weird Kung Fu stuff where it's like 2 knuckles, 3 knuckles, 1 knuckle, finger, 2 fingers. I mean,
pinky finger.
Pinky finger.
The whooshy finger hold.
Whooshy finger hold. We've got all these. But how different is a karate punch from a Taekwondo punch? And is that dependent on which instructor you learned from?
Yeah.
And is it dependent on your body type and how well you listened to your instructor?
Yeah.
Yes, it is. Fundamentally, they start blending, especially at the edges, especially as you become more competent. At the beginning, they're going to teach you a very rigid form. This is what a proper punch looks like. And then you settle into your fighting stance and start sparring, and nobody continues doing punches the way they were taught in karate class. Inevitably, your guard comes up, and they start looking oddly similar to other martial arts. And so eventually, even the labels start to break down. And so at that point, which martial art is the best starts becoming a very difficult to answer question, because what if the martial arts themselves don't exist as separate things?
Or at least the boundaries between them are not hard and fast.
Yeah, at which point you start caring a whole lot more about who instructed you and how well you paid attention than what the sign said above the door.
Yes, yeah. We're going to take a brief pause for just a second to talk to you guys about Audible.
Which is awesome.
Yes. Audible, how do we love thee? Let us count the ways, right? So Audible is a giant leading provider of online audio content. They have scads of stuff, and that is a scientific term. A scad is, I don't want to give the precise number because it doesn't correspond perfectly to our numerical system, but I would say that there are at least 17 or 18 scads of books and other forms of audio content on Audible. In fact, I'm embarrassed to say I can't remember the name of the book right now, but a few months ago I listened to a book of Japanese samurai proverbs on Audible, which was really cool. The translation is top-notch, or at least that was what I was told by experts, is that I don't know enough Japanese to really say, right, obviously. The translation was top-notch, and it was so cool to get inside the heads of, I think it was about 17th century samurai, and figure out the way they were thinking, and to see them wrestle with contradictions about combat and life and death. and other cool stuff like that. So that's one of the things that Audible has. Even if you are a martial arts person, Audible has something for you.
That's awesome.
They really do.
There are some good books. I need to give disclaimers with both of these, but two books that I read that are nonfiction, personal memoir type books are The Autumn Lightning. It's a story about a kid living in California who found an old Japanese swordsmanship master and asked him to teach him, and about his experiences learning basically kendo. And then there's another one called American Shaolin, which is kind of terrible and kind of fascinating. I'm not sure how true it is, the experiences, but ostensibly it's the story of this guy.
It's kind of like wire work kung fu movies, right? Like you're like, you can't do that, but it's still really cool to watch.
It's a memoir, and so take some things with a grain of salt.
Okay.
That's where it's a very polished memoir, let's say,
okay.
about this gentleman who goes and studies kung fu in the 80s at the Shaolin Monastery and has experiences there and learns and grows, and it was an interesting book. So those are two. So
you can get a free month of Audible, complete with 2 Audible originals and a free audiobook that you get to keep even if you cancel your membership at audibletrial.com/goodandbasic, and if you use that link, if you use that address, then we get
I recommend his
we
book
benefit
over
from
mine
that. So
too. Those ones should be further down
the
list.
Samurai Proverb book, I was actually really impressed because now we're moving right back into the podcast. Anyway, audibletrial.com/goodandbasic. But it's really interesting to see, even though I've just said, hey, like I think martial arts can and should be good for a lot of things besides combat application, right? Combat application is a non-negligible part of this equation, right? Like it just is.
It is.
Right. And so it's really interesting to see people wrestle with questions of life and death.
It is, and one of those questions that I find fascinating is combat preparedness.
Mm-hmm.
How much time should you be investing in being aware for every possible situation?
Mm-hmm.
How paranoid should you become, basically? Should you train from positions and assume that you're going to be attacked while lying down? I mean, should you be armed to the teeth at all times and be wearing your secret ninja armor? I mean.
Do you mind if I ask a question real fast,
Certainly.
just so we decide the direction for like the last 12 minutes or so of the podcast? Do you want to talk about life and death and that issues? Or I thought another cool thing to do would be you tell everybody about your favorite martial arts movie and the lessons you get from it, and then I do the same.
That would be good.
Does that sound fun?
Let's briefly cover the life and death topic and then jump into the movies.
Sounds good.
I think that would be fantastic.
All right.
Spoiler alert, minus Kung Fu Panda.
I knew that.
Yes, you did.
Could see that coming a mile away.
Yep. Yes, you could. Great movie. The life and death question is fascinating to me because it forces you to grapple with the limits of what you can and can't do, and that is a really valuable thing. Any martial art that is teaching you to be invincible is lying.
Well, and to you, this is also one of the big lessons that you can pull from strategy games and from military strategy is that you're encountering another adversarial mind that is not totally under your control.
Yes.
You are encountering uncertainty.
You are encountering uncertainty and reality. Two of the things there, I mean, you unpack both of those. In a combat situation, even a combat situation in a game, you are meeting two things. One is a mind separate from your own. In other words, you cannot be...
that is adversarial, too.
Solipsist. It's adversarial. It has different interests from you. You're not just following the rules to achieve an end. You're not playing solitaire.
Yeah, a punch in the mouth really is the solution to philosophic solipsism.
It is.
Right. Unless you're the kind of
universe?
person who invented punching yourself in the mouth, in which case I have nothing to say. I have nothing to say.
On so many levels.
I have nothing to say.
So it solves solipsism, and at the same time, there are very, very real standards for what works and what doesn't, and what is real and what isn't.
You're alive or you're dead. You're
alive or you're dead. You've succeeded or you haven't. You have a bloody lip or you don't. The block caught the punch or it didn't. And these standards are very real and very objective and also subjective in terms of application. So there's this beautiful fusion of all these elements. I actually personally have a rule that when I am trying to judge the credibility of a philosopher, one of the things that I need to see is, one, do they have a family life? Because that tells me how well they're able to deal with another mind and deal with the issues related, the philosophical issues of children, like how agency builds over time. And the major one for me is, did they have experience with hand-to-hand combat? And for René Descartes, the answer is yes. And for Socrates, the answer is yes. And for Kant, it's most definitely no. Plato, Aristotle, Socrates. Plato, in particular, his name wasn't actually Plato. Plato was his name from wrestling.
Broad shoulders,
broad
right?
shoulders. So that's something that gives them a little bit of credibility, where I know that they have firsthand experience with other minds and with an extremely real form of reality, which will tell you no to your theories. So now movies. I've already spoiled mine.
Yeah,
I'll talk about it later.
So mine is Jet Li's Fearless. It's 2006. It stars Jet Li. And wow, where do I even go? So it's about oh no, I'm trying to remember his name. Hu Wenjia, and I apologize. All the pronunciations in this video, I have no defense, so apologize for that. But Hu Wenjia is a Chinese martial artist. He's famous for starting the Jingwu school of Kung Fu, and
he's a real person.
He's a real historical person, although the movie plays around with stuff, obviously. Fantastic movie. Even if you're just interested in the fight scenes, these are some of the craziest fight scenes. He fights a samurai with a 3-section staff, and if you've never seen a 3-section staff, go Google it and get ready to have your mind blown. But one of the core ideas in the movie is about the nature of competition, the nature of martial arts. There's 2 conversations that are had in particular near the end, so I hope this isn't too much of a spoiler. But in one, an individual says to compete is to win. Right? Why do we compete? Why do we fight each other? Why is it that why do we fight each other? Why is there conflict? And why do we have these schools of martial arts? And one individual says, well, to compete is to win. That's the purpose of why we have kung fu matches. And then another character is asked the same question. So why is it that we fight each other? And he says, well, I think the purpose of fighting each other is to discover ourselves. And I think it's still a bit of a mystical answer, but it comes really close to describing my own philosophy of martial arts, right? Like I mentioned in my Everything is Kung Fu video, this is a question that I had to ask myself all the time while I was practicing, right? Is why are you doing this, Joseph? Right? What are you hoping to get out of this? Why is this working for you? And the answer is it makes you more aware of things. It makes you able to make quality decisions. So that's my Kung Fu movie. I would highly recommend it. Great film. It's a sad film in many ways. It's kind of a tragic film. It's a serious, heavy film, right? But so good.
Oh,
so
that's a close second for me. After other installments in the Kung Fu Panda series.
So Kung Fu Panda.
Kung Fu Panda. So that movie to me was I heard the voice of God through Kung Fu Panda when I was in high school, and I don't mean that in jest. For me, it was a place where I could see truth expressed, and that might sound super silly, but for me, it has a very special place in my heart for that reason. And there's a principle in the Book of Mormon, actually. There's a gentleman by the name of Nephi right at the beginning of the book who is asked to do an impossible task, and his response is, "I will go and do. For I know that the Lord giveth no commandment unto the children of men, save he shall prepare a way for them that they may accomplish the task," basically. Accomplish the thing that he commandeth them. So his faith is that if I am given a divine assignment, the way will be prepared. And even if I don't understand how, it will be prepared. And as I was contemplating my future life and my potential and my struggles and my weaknesses and trying to figure out, is there a place in the world for this 15-year-old kid named Joseph with really odd hobbies.
You're here too. Like,
yeah.
Don't. I mean.
Yeah, it's true.
You meaning the listener, right? Like.
Yeah. So. Well. So that was me, and then the Kung Fu Panda film more or less follows that plot. There's Po the panda, who is incompetent, or at least seems incompetent, and then he is called to a very specific assignment that seems way out of his league. And it turns out over the course of the film that everything that makes him him, including his weaknesses, let me express it slightly differently. So he's called to be the Dragon Warrior, and his instructor has a certain vision for what the Dragon Warrior will look like. We actually have that character Tai Lung,
which not an overweight panda.
Incidentally, in Chinese means Supreme Dragon. So, I mean, you've got the Supreme Dragon, the one who represents what everyone thinks the dragon should look like, the Dragon Warrior, and that is Tai Lung, the bad guy, who's currently rotting in prison. And then he escapes and goes on his rampage, and Po the panda has to rise up to meet him, and it's interesting that his bulk is his armor. It's the thing that is able to prevent him from getting nerve punched out of the game by Tai Lung. And as he trains, he makes real changes. He doesn't stay the same slob. I mean, he's correcting and improving himself, but the improved version of Po the Panda is still Po the Panda. The improved, glorified, perfected version of Po the Panda, the one that is rising to his assignment, is not a carbon copy of Tai Lung. And so that is, to me, an extremely profound film in that the way is provided and there's a specifically Po-ish solution to that problem. Yeah. And that he doesn't have to sacrifice who and what he is, but he does need to improve who and what he is. Yeah. And so that, to me, is a really cool thing. Yeah. There's also some cool stuff about the form and the formless there.
There's actually a surprising amount of good stuff in Kung Fu Panda. Yep. More than you'd imagine for a children's cartoon. Yep. But wow, it is there. Okay, well, another thing I mentioned to Joseph before we started recording this podcast is I was like, you know what, this is going to be like trying to squeeze Niagara Falls through a kitchen faucet, because we have a lot of thoughts about this and a lot that we want to share. We hope that this has been helpful and productive for you and interesting. We're probably going to do more stuff in the future, figuring out exactly what it is, but this will have to come out later because for both of us, these ideas about martial arts are things that have, well, we have each gone deep enough into it that it's spread out and infected, cross-pollinated, everything else. So yeah, anything else you want to say?
We're grateful that you listen. We look forward to hearing from you, and also hopefully for you to hear from us again in the future.
Yep. We'll see you next time.